You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare, hosted by Mick Cook, brought to you by Hollow Street Media.
This show started talking about a guy who came up with a very thick book. Actually, he didn't. His wife came up with a book. He just had a heap of papers sitting around in a trunk, loosely gathered together. A bit like the back end of this show, all the processes and technical duties that I do. But this guy, the show's named after, started talking about concepts around war, and there was another person who, around the same time, a bit of a competitor, literally a competitor on the battlefield at times, who talked about these other things called principles of war. In fact, Big Carl also wrote about principles of war. So principles of war have been around for a while. They're still applied in modern militaries. But are they useful? Are they applied the same way? And what's a more modern take? G'day listeners, and welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast. Thanks very much for the success of the season. That's right, I'm not the one that makes the show successful. You are, as the audience. Just kidding. And the success is all down to me. It's got nothing to do with you listeners. But I still thank you for listening to the show anyway. It has been great to see the reaction to some of our most recent episodes, the ones on Nazi child soldiers, wargaming, and the Russian-Ukraine war. And I'll tell you what, 2 years ago, I don't think those are three topics I would have put in a sentence together. But it's been brilliant listening to the responses from some of the listeners and reading the responses from some of the listeners on our interviews with those guests and those quite diverse topics, particularly people's responses to wargaming, those people who didn't really understand how wargaming was applied in the civilian sector, particularly at levels such as NATO, and also, of course, the episode on Russian population's views on the Russian-Ukraine war. Because I think for a lot of us in the Western world, there's a bit of an eye-opener in what the actual data says about the Russian population's views of the war, and we tend to see it through a very mediated lens, and even with social media and that, we tend not to see the ground truth, I suppose. And so that was quite an interesting topic. Bravo to our guests for accepting some pretty short notice requests and not grilling me too hard on some of the obtuse questions I asked. But today we're doing a different style of episode. I mentioned in the intro we're talking about the principles of war, and those people who will subscribe to our Apple Premium might get a little bit more about the principles of war in this episode as well. And when we talk about the principles of war and concepts like that, one thing always strikes a chord with me is, do they still work? Are they still something that's important to militaries? Having been a serving military officer and having gone on a war of, I'll say, a war of folly, I can say that because we lost. It's interesting to see whether or not these are applied at the tactical level, at the operational level, and are they thought about at the strategic level? Because, at the strategic level, not much else apart from thinking happens. But I'm not an expert on it. I haven't researched it and I haven't written on it, which is probably for the best, because there are a lot of people that are not experts on things that do write on things, and that can be a problem, especially if you're a podcast producer trying to find the right people. But I think I found the right guest today. My guest today is Lieutenant Colonel Amos Fox, and he is a US Army officer, writer, and PhD candidate at the University of Reading. He is an editor at the Wavell Room, that brilliant British-run PME, Professional Military Education, for those new listeners. Website. It's been going for a number of years now and going strong. Absolutely fantastic resource for people. In fact, I might catch up with the Wavell Room team while I'm over doing the Dead Prussian's European tour later this year. And Amos's research focuses on modern war studies, and I'll put that in a generic bucket because if you follow Amos, he's got a wide range of published material on modern war. So that's probably the best term I could come up with it. There's probably a few specific lines we could follow, such as the principles of war today. Amos, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Mick, thank you very much for the opportunity. Like I said when we were chatting beforehand, I feel like this is one of those long-time listener, first-time caller situations for me. So I appreciate the invitation. I'm happy to be here today talking with you.
I'm glad we've got a long-time listener, and please, Amos, regardless of how this experience goes for you, and not all guests find it pleasant, but regardless of how this experience goes for you, please remain a long-time listener, purely for the fact that we are now an advertising-supported show, and I need money. But Amos, before we start discussing your paper on the principles of war, and I'm keen to learn what motivated you to transition from soldier to scholar, and the reason I'm not asking you why you became a soldier is mainly because I think you'll be able to roll it all up into the one answer. But I think the transition from soldier to scholar is quite an interesting one. So why did you go from, this is practitioner to thinker?
Just the obligatory comment at the beginning before I start, I'm still actively serving for about another year until I retire. So everything that I'm saying now is completely independent and in my own opinions, and doesn't reflect the Department of Defense or the Department of the Army. With that out of the way, so I got into the scholarship of things. There's, I think, two pivotal points. So I started off before I came into the Army. I coached college football, American football, at Butler University in Indianapolis. And as part of being a coach, you're always seeking to understand how and why, and looking for trends in the way people do things and the way the environment operates. And so that analytical coaching mind is something that's never left me from the time that I stepped away from coaching and came into the Army as an active duty Army officer. And so that's always been the way that I've approached things. But then there was another pivotal point, and it's really the springboard that got me to where I'm at today. So at the time, I was a tank company commander at the National Training Center with the Army's 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. And we had just gone back to, we had just started the decisive action training environment rotation. So the date fight, the big, large scale armor formations smashing together fights out there in the desert. And so we did a bunch of training leading up to that. We did the first rotation, and it went really, really well for the Op 4, because that's who I was. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment's the opposing force at the National Training Center. And afterwards, I had a really great squadron executive officer, and I was chatting with him like a few days after the rotation had ended, and we were talking about fighting. And I was explaining to him how, because my company had done quite successful out there, and I was explaining to him my mental process where fighting. And he said, what you're saying to me sounds like a book that I read. And he had gone to SAS, which is the Air Force equivalent of the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies. And when he was in SAS, he said that he had read this book by this guy named Robert Leonard, who I had never heard of at the time. And I was fortunate enough to meet and hang out with last week, which was really awesome. But he said, you've got to read this book because a lot of the ideas that you're talking about sound like what he wrote about in this book. And the book is Fighting by Minutes. And so Fighting by Minutes, Time and the Art of War. And so I read that book. I picked it up. I bought it. I read it. And that was it. It was like a Stephen Hawking approach to understanding the intricacies of combat and war as a whole. And so that book basically started me on my journey, because I was like, this is exactly what I want to do. And so from there, I started looking into other things. One of my big things at the time was I wanted to understand maneuver warfare. And so I delved deep into picking it apart and trying to understand how it worked and all the ideas behind it. And then I just gradually moved on from there. And so that previous experience that I had as a football coach, coupled with that conversation that I had with my squadron executive officer, I would say were the two things that got me going down this path that I'm on now.
It's amazing the power of books and the trajectories they can set us on, and also getting to meet your heroes, right? Your intellectual heroes. I'm probably more of your physical kind of hero, but your intellectual heroes are it's quite surreal, right? This show's provided me some great opportunities, and it's just cool hearing that. And because then when you dig into a book, you can then ask some questions, and sometimes those questions are welcome. Sometimes those questions are like, "Hey, just keep that under the lid, and I'll issue that in a revised edition." Hopefully, you're able to provide some points for the revised edition. And one thing that Robert Leonard comes up in is your paper. So I really want to have a chat with your paper about your paper, which was published in 2021 in the midst of COVID. And I was saying just before this, so we've been connected for a long time, and I tend to read a fair bit of what you put out, unless it's during COVID. Right, I didn't read much because it was just it was a rubbish time being locked down. So this paper went under my radar, and then I saw it on LinkedIn the other day, and I was like, wow. And had a read of it. And like I said in the intro, Principles of War are one of those things. It's a bit like Klaus Hitz's book, except, not as maligned as much as that book in terms of people's quoting and not reading. I think people have read at least a list of Principles of War. In fact, I know there's a lot of militaries where it's been drummed into soldiers and officers. These are the Principles of War. Just learn these concepts. Off you go. You'll be fine. Although none of the Principles of War teach you how to do like a flanking attack. So there's a limit to their utility. So having a read of this was excellent because the title of your paper is On the Principles of War, Reorganizing Thought and Practice for Large-Scale Combat Operations. And I think for many of us after the 20 or so years of counterinsurgency style warfare, that did have some what you could call large-scale combat operations in them, particularly 2003 was large-scale combat operations. And then you have similar activities in the midst of the Afghanistan war around the 2009-2010 stages when they were doing things like Operation Mostarak, and you had large numbers of ISAF forces fighting with very large numbers of ANA to secure key parts of places like Helmand and the north and the northwestern areas of Afghanistan, but nothing like what we would probably consider conventional warfare, large-scale operations. 2003 was probably the last one that we know of in the Western experience. And I say that in the Western experience, I kind of mean the Anglophile experience, those English-speaking countries, because we know right now there's large-scale combat operations happening, and they're blending the technologies that were developed in irregular warfare over the past 20 years, and they're using them for large-scale combat operations at the moment. So we've got some really interesting sorts of areas happening. So going back to fundamentals like principles is quite important. So I'm really glad that this popped up in my LinkedIn feed. And for those listeners that don't follow me on LinkedIn, I don't want you to. But feel free to try and follow me. But I found it really interesting. So are you able to provide our listeners with a summary of your paper before we get into the details?
Yeah, so essentially I wrote this based off some looking forward at what I was anticipating coming. And so Western militaries are reorienting for large-scale combat operations. But based off, you mentioned earlier, some of the other stuff I work on, I've done a great deal of work on the Russo-Ukrainian war. And I wrote my SAMS monograph about it. I've written several other things about it. And one of the things that I always found when I was working on that was that it wasn't over, so 2015, when the dust settled to a degree, in my interpretation or my understanding of, the international relations there between Russia and Ukraine, that Russia would come back. And so as I thought about that, and I thought about the Western militaries transitioning to large-scale combat operations, thinking, I went back and looked at the Principles of War, and they slapped me in the face as being fundamentally finitely tactical, and really only just applicable to battle, and I would say battles of the Napoleonic era. And so that's why I set out to write this paper. I was like, hey, we got to do an update here, and I knew that Robert Leonard had written a book on the subject that was really good too. It was Principles of War for the Information Age, and that was also a really, really good. It still is a really good read. There are a few things that are dated. The book was published in like the late '90s, but it's still way ahead of its time. And so that was really the context. It was, the Western militaries were starting to look at the future and going back to large scale combat operations, and then I also was anticipating Russia reinvading Ukraine like they did in 2022. And so that was really the impetus for starting to work on this paper.
It's interesting, right? The Anglophile view of the war over in Eastern Europe at the moment. When I went through staff college, we had a Ukrainian officer on our course. Sadly, he's passed away from illness, and just having a good chat with him, it wasn't over in the way that in the way that the international system defines conflicts as being over, and it's interesting to see how people understood that conflict on this side of the fence, and then talking to the people that are actually living there and doing it. And I think what we're seeing at the moment, one, it's horrendous, but two, it should teach a lot of us to ask a lot more questions, not just about how we fight, but how we conclude wars. And as I like to say, militaries don't conclude wars, politicians do. Not that I have a large number of politicians listening to this show anymore. But we'll get there. Maybe those political staffers that I know listen to this show can start sliding it back into their briefing packs. As I said, we're an advertising-supported show, people. You also... the good thing is you give us a bit of a history, right? And the best thing I like about this paper, Amos, is it's brief, right? You could have gone back a lot further, at least 100 years, minimum 100 years you could have gone back further in this paper and delving into the history and giving a detailed account. If you had included Yomini, and you could have talked about Big Carl. I mean, that's a slight against your name for not including him. But you could have gone back to Sun Tzu if you wanted to, and some of the principles he puts forward, right? But you've kind of done it for the modern and, dare I say, mechanised style army. And this might be because you're a tanky, or it might be because you're a football coach, which has nothing to do with it. But I needed a segue to say last night was the last ever episode of Ted Lasso. So I no longer have any US football coaches as my idols. So that's you've taken on the mantle. You're my lasso. But you start off by discussing JFC Fuller's attempts at codifying principles of war. Well, actually, not attempts. He did. He codified some principles of war. For our listeners, I haven't done an episode on Fuller. So for our listeners, who was Fuller and what were his principles of war? And I know he had several iterations. Feel free to walk us through all of them.
Yeah, so JFC Fuller was I guess you could give him two hats, three perhaps, if you want to count his dabbling in the occult as a third hat. He was a very strange fellow, but also a very dynamic thinker. And so he was a 20th century British military theorist. That's how I think of him most often. But then also he was a British Army officer. He rose to the rank of Major General in the British Army. And he wore various hats along the way and irritated quite a few people along the way because he was such an independent thinker. And he set the foundation through a lot of his early writing following the First World War for what became Blitzkrieg and armored warfare theory. And so a lot of it was ignored by the British and read by the Germans. And that's why you see the Germans open the Second World War the way that they do. A lot of that was based directly on the ideas of Fuller. Fuller had tried to push the envelope a bit and say that infantry and all sorts of other arms were not going to be needed, and that it would just be fleets of tanks operating like battleships on an ocean, fighting on the battlefield. But that was a bit overboard. But that's essentially in like a very finite description who he was. In terms of the principles of war and his work on the principles of war, he started writing his principles of war in a paper called Training Soldiers for War, where I believe he was a captain at the time. It was shortly after the end of the First World War, and he had set out to come up with a basic foundation to help guide his organization and the British Army on how to train soldiers. And so he was trying to think of a pithy, punchy way to get this is what we need to do when we're fighting way of thinking into the minds of the people or of the soldiers within his organization, but then the British Army as a whole. And so his early, in Training for Soldiers, that's when he first put down on paper his principles, and they were objective, mass, offensive, security, surprise, and movement. And he said that those had to be the foundation of any doctrine. And he suggested also that those principles couldn't be viewed in isolation of one another. You couldn't go down and use them as a checklist and say, I'm going to use this one, but not this one. they all intertwined and operated together. They had a synergistic effect on one another. And so, for instance, you shouldn't use offensive without mass, because if you didn't use mass with the offensive, you'd essentially piecemeal yourself into the fight. And so a lot of these ideas were born out of the horrible experience that the British Army had in the First World War, in terms of just the massive amount of casualties and the challenges that they had getting through that conflict. And so that was his first attempt at the principles of war. And then later he updated it in his 1920 Rusty paper. I don't have the title in my head, but it's commonly referred to as his gold medal essay, because he won a gold medal for a Rusty writing competition. Rusy's the Royal United Services Institute there in the UK, for anybody that's not familiar with it. And then in that paper, he updated it. So he moved from 6 principles to 8 principles. So the 8 principles that he had during that iteration were objective, offensive, concentration, economy of force. So that's one of the things that he added. Cooperation, movement, surprise, and security. And so he was honing these ideas and refining these ideas and trying to come up with a better way of thinking about it. And I think that he did a really good job. I'm going to read briefly just a paragraph. So he put these, again, as I said, we tend to view them as almost a checklist, or we come up with a mnemonic to remember these things. But he really viewed it as a collective idea. And so, for instance, the one, I'm going to read this just so you have it and so you can understand his way of thinking. But he said, and this is how he viewed the principles as a collective idea. He said, advancing against the enemy's main force, and then in parentheses, objective, with the intention of destroying it, in parentheses, offensive, with the greatest strength possible, and then in parentheses there, concentration and economy of force, with the least friction, in parentheses, cooperation, is in the shortest time possible, in parentheses, movement, so that it may be taken unawares, surprise is in parentheses there, without undue risk to ourselves. And then in that parenthesis there, he has security. And so it was a construct. It wasn't just a set of things to do. It was a construct. And so, again, it goes back to him trying to teach, his formation, the British Army, how to fight and how to think about fighting. And then later down the road, he did a third update to it, expanded it to 9 principles, adding offensive action and then slightly modifying some of the words there. But in 1926, you can find those principles enunciated in his book, The Foundations of the Science of War, which I think is one of the best, hands down books on military theory. There's a few things clearly that have, been passed by time. He talks about grand tactics, although I think a lot of his ideas on grand tactics you could apply to the operational level today, and they still make a great deal of sense. But in effect, that's where Fuller went from the beginning to the end of it, and those form the foundation of what the Western, or I think even outside Western militaries, but certainly Western Anglophile militaries are using today.
Fuller's such an interesting character for listeners out there. Yes, we know he was a fascist. Yes, we know he was a Nazi sympathiser. Fuller was investigated quite a bit, and there's a great quote from Alan Brooke saying, I don't think he had any unpatriotic intentions, but Fuller also thinks the wrong side won the Second World War. So I mean, he's a tough character, right? And I think some of his later actions has kept him on the periphery sometimes. In discussions, I've got a book by Fuller. It's the biography of Julius Caesar, which kind of gives you a hint as to the sorts of people that he admired. Right, his nickname was Boney, apparently after Napoleon Bonaparte and stuff. So it's interesting. Fuller, I just find an interesting character. I probably should have had someone talk about him on the show a bit more, and maybe I'll do that. But what he had provided is really interesting in the context of the principles of war and how they were tied together. And then you fast forward to their application. Blitzkrieg was largely based on a lot of his writings. We know that Hans Guderian translated one of Fuller's books. So it's good that you started with Fuller. One, it's good that you shied away from the controversy around Fuller. Not enough people write about Fuller. And two, he didn't just set down some principles of war and say, hey, I know everything right at the start, right? He's revised his own work and applied them, which is good. So we move forward in time, and your paper was published by the Association of the United States Army, which is a fantastic organisation. They provide a lot of reading material that I ignore for a year and then read it and then finally interview someone. And then realise I should have read it when it was first published. But that association does a lot for the intellectual growth of the US Army. And I guess this kind of points out that Western militaries are interested in the principles of war still, and they still apply them. So how does Western militaries adapt and incorporate the principles of war? And feel free to tell me how the US Army does it within the caveats on what you can comment on. Obviously, please don't give us anything that's sensitive, but the application of the principle of wars in the modern day, are they how Fuller envisioned them?
Yeah, I think that generally speaking, they're not necessarily used in any real sense that I've seen. We every now and then we'll throw one out and be like, hey, don't forget, economy of force is a principle of war. But often that's said in the context of saying, I'm not going to give you everything you're asking for, right? And it's not actually used in the sense of, hey, like this is an actual principle we need to account for. And so outside of like a few situations, I think generally speaking, like they're just used often in terms of like good old, old fashioned heuristics where it's, the old guy, the gray beard telling the young guy, hey, don't forget about the principles of war. But generally speaking, I think a lot of times we tend to avoid them. And then at the same time, I also think, and this is, one of the driving forces behind my paper, is that they're antiquated. They're based on a way of warfare that is not necessarily applicable today. And so, they're derivative of Napoleonic warfare, right? And so I'm a huge Napoleon fan myself. I've got a little bobblehead of Napoleon behind me. I've got Napoleon crossing the Alps on my wall here in my office. I've got Chandler's The Campaigns of Napoleon on my shelf, plus like 4 other books that he's written on Napoleon, and tons of other stuff on the Napoleonic Wars. And so when I say that about them being derivative of Bonaparte's wars, I don't say that in any kind of like negative sense at all. Not that anybody cares if I'm denigrating Napoleon anyway. However, a lot of the nuance that I think that went along with Fuller's ideas was tied to that. And so what I mean by that was armies were fragile and brittle back then, far more so than they are today. Today, armies, generally speaking, bring to bear the breadth and depth of what their societies can put behind them, to varying degrees, of course. But back then it was a little different, right? And so this is one of the things too, one of the knocks that I have on the idea of centers of gravity, which I've written about as well. Centers of gravity were cool when the head of state was leading his army on the field of battle, because you could go out and smash the army and the head of state would say, whoa, 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 I need to negotiate, right? And so you would see that idea had a lot more viability. And I think in many cases, the principles of war that Fuller came up with are aligned to that as well, right? They're not talking about big scale campaigns and wars that last years. It's talking about essentially how to win a battle, how to do something finite and small and do it quickly. And so that's where I think, to a degree, the principles of war, we still talk about them, but we haven't embraced changing the ideas with the change of the future. And that's what I think was good. That's a good lesson from Fuller as well, is, the guy that we've modeled our principles of war on, we being the West, he did 3 updates and between 1914 and 1926. Yet, the Western military's principles of war have largely remained the same since they adopted Fuller's principles of war in like 1930.
Yes.
And so conflict is different. Wars are different. States fight wars differently. And so that's why I think the idea needs a reboot. And again, that was, a big part of the impetus for this paper was thinking about that.
I love that you brought that point up, because we see it with things like, we see it with Big Carl's works, right? People read it and they're like, oh, but he was saying this. And, the underlying thing with Big Carl is he's saying, I want you to think about war. and he puts things in there that are opposing thoughts to have you think about them. I mean, some of the sections on logistics and stuff you can just literally ignore, right? It's like you read Caesar's Gallic Wars. There's some great lessons in there, but there's some stuff in there you probably just can ignore, right? But you've got to update it. People talk about when modern films steal from Shakespeare. Like, if you think Shakespeare came up with all those plot lines himself, I mean, he was ripping stuff off left, right, and centre. So you've got to adapt it, and the danger is if you don't, you stagnate. Glad that you're a big fan of Napoleon, because one, he was an artillery officer, and everyone should be big fans of artillery officers. But two, he's quite an interesting character, right? Because his understanding of warfare at the time was something that shocked a lot of people, but also he's done a lot for the world that the world doesn't understand, also in the statesman area. But then also he went crazy, and well, I say crazy, he nominated himself first consul and then became emperor, and he's sitting there going, oh man, you were so close to establishing the EU. And in a way, he kind of established an EU, but it was a little bit more autocratic than.
That's right. I was going to say under his thumb, though.
Yeah. It was under his benevolent thumb. But the next section in your paper that I really want to talk about, and this is you've talked a little bit about it already, and this is one that's put a book on my radar to go out and grab. A book that has been around, as I said, I don't always get to things when they're published. And this one's been around for a while. In fact, I completely missed On War when it was published in 1832. Just did not grab it off the shelf.
I missed that one too.
Yeah, and this one, the work by Robert Leonard. I'm going to go and grab it because I always need a good excuse to grab a new book, and my co-producer Brooke's on the line now, and I'm probably going to use some of the podcast funds to buy that book, and just maybe I won't tell her. But Robert Leonard's done some principles as well, which is good because what we're talking about with Western militaries, they didn't adapt them, and it's bonkers when you think about not adapting them, given the number of wars that have occurred, right? Including the Second World War, the biggest war ever. But then in the mid to late 90s, we have Leonard come through with his principles. So what are Leonard's principles?
So for Robert Leonard, his Principles of War for the Information Age came out in 1998. He was one of the early graduates, or one of the graduates from one of the first, not the first, but one of the first classes out of the School of Advanced Military Studies. And so, I always am deferential to the early guys, because they're really the ones who push the envelopes, the early SAMS graduates. I'm a SAMS graduate myself. And so I look at guys like that and I'm like, these guys help forge the school that helps drive thinking across the U.S. Army and many Western militaries. Because as you said too, or as you mentioned, at your staff college, you had a Ukrainian officer. I had a Ukrainian officer in my class, had a British officer, had people from all over. And so anyhow, Robert Leonard's book is essentially saying, hey, technology is coming or is here. It was the late 90s. So I think my kids, when I talk to my kids about the late 90s and the technology that existed and how cool it was, they're like, what? That's not technology at all. That's like the Stone Age. But, Leonard was thinking ahead and saying, hey, like, this stuff's coming and we need to think about it. And so the interesting thing that Leonard does that I think carries over from Dead Carl is he talks about the duality of everything. And so his principles aren't based off what I want to do, right? And they're not based off universal things necessarily. They're based off, if I want to do this, the enemy's going to want to do that. And so everything has a yin and yang to it. And so his principles, he groups them based off principles of war, but then also principles of, there's three blocks: principles of aggression and principles of interaction, and then principles of control. And within the principles of action, he has two principles. The first is, and again, they're dualities, right? They're tied together. It's dislocation and confrontation. And those two things work together. And then there's distribution and concentration, right? So you want to be distributed or do you want to concentrate? And then moving down to the principles of interaction, there's two within that category as well. There's opportunity and reaction, and then activity and security. And then within the principles of control, his third big block principle, there's operation, acceleration, and objective, and then command and anarchy. And all of these are, like I said, they're two sides of a coin that you have to work through as you're addressing things. And so he wrote that and again, you'll have to read the book to get into the detail, but these principles and the way that he lays them out are a very good update to the existing principles of war, taking that Clausewitzian idea of duality forward into the information age, or what at the time was deemed the information age, and saying this is how we should think about war and combat. And so it's a very, very good primer for somebody that's looking to expand their mind, because I think Leonard's work's always terrific too, because it really does make you step out of yourself and say, what is it that I really believe, and what is it that I really think? And I think that any true theorist, their work should do that to you. And I also think that we don't today value theories and theorists as much as we should, because they're really the ones that are pushing the envelope and getting us to think about how to address things in the future. And so Leonard's book and Leonard's ideas do that, I think, in spades.
It's good to talk about the technologies of the late 90s, because my kids also have a problem with it. And it's just disappointing, right? But the way that Leonard has actually consolidated, I'm going to say consolidated, but he's reframed, I suppose, these principles in a way that isn't necessarily, like, a lot of people will look at that and hear that and go, oh, it's a reductionist approach, but it's actually not. When you look at the tables in your paper, he's actually expanded and reworked principles, which is good, because it also categorises the principles as well, which is important to know, rather than just a shopping list, right? And anyone who's been in a military knows that you get thrown a lot of shopping lists to learn, and they're not contextualised, and so they're not expanded and adapted and moved on. So that's what I really liked about this paper, and going through them. And he uses the categories of knowledge and ignorance to categorise them as well. It's a really, really clever way of doing it. I'm sure he's had success, but hey, done. I'm going to move to a premium question now, which is for our Apple Podcast Premium subscribers. And these are subscribers that can tap a little button on their app that throws some tin towards the Dead Prussian podcast and Hollow Street Media, so we can keep producing shows of varying quality, hopefully increasing quality. So we'll have a quick pause now, move away from all the cheap people who just take the free content, and move into those quality people who help us pay for the show. And now we are back with our broader audience, our lovely people who listen to our ads, which I suppose in a way still helps you pay for the show if you want to sleep at night, those people who don't subscribe through Apple Premium Podcast. And if it's because you don't use Apple, then you get given a blanket level of forgiveness, and I will endeavour to get premium episodes to you on your platforms. Now, Amos, my penultimate question in the run sheet, I've written some notes there that have absolutely nothing related to your topic, but I'm hoping you can run with it anyway. My cut and paste is a podcaster's greatest friend and its worst enemy. But you can guess the topic of my next interview, actually, by reading that line there, Amos. Keep it quiet. My penultimate question relates to the title of your paper, right, which is what suckered me. And it wasn't just because you posted it. Yes, I read all the smart stuff you post, but you're also very very gracious for other people's reading and writing and audio content. And if you're a competing podcast, I will never listen to your show. But you do provide a lot there. So I are noticing some of the spelling errors in here. I started at 4:00 this morning, ladies and gents, so you can blame that, even though I sent this at least 5 or 6 hours before that. But I want to know how you, after going through this intellectual thought process, how you would reorganise, adapt and redraft the principles of war for modern large-scale combat operations.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is you have to take a step back and think about what is war. And I'm not going to jump to the last question now, but I think I will inadvertently say my answer to that question as I'm talking right now. But I think it's important to understand that I firmly believe in the idea that systems theory, systems thinking is how we, the international community, militaries, anything really interacts, right? And so Danella, I'm pointing at my bookshelf like anybody can see it. Danella Sparks wrote a really, Danella Meadows wrote a really good book, and it was published after her death. She died inadvertently, but she has a really good book on systems thinking, right? And so this is one of the things that I got into as I started exploring all these ideas. And again, it's not the John Boyd version of systems thinking, because part of the problem with, or not John Boyd, but John Warden, I'm sorry, John Warden and his 5 rings theory. It's not that systems theory. I think he was on the right track, but he got off the mark because he viewed things through the lens of a closed system, even though he didn't say closed system. I think he often talked about open system, but he misunderstood open systems. So I preface my comments on the principles of war with that, because I think that understanding is critical to understanding how operational level and strategic level war and warfare occur. And so the first thing that I think you have to understand is that war is a competition between 2 or more actors and their systems, right? The things that they bring to bear at a national level that they can plug into their warfighting system. And so those systems operate based off learning, right? They have feedback loops. They're sensing and feeling and learning from the environment. They're just not out there stumbling forward and getting killed, right? And so self-preservation, I think, is the first rule of any open system, right? It's out there trying to live. It's not going to do things. It's not going to step into your plan and say, hey, what's your plan? I want to get killed, right? And so that influences that thinking as well. They sense, they reflect, they adapt, they learn because they're trying to avoid destruction, right? Self-preservation is the key. Information, because of the feedback loops in that learning process, information is essentially the currency that makes the open system, the open adaptive system run. And so as part of that, systems will pursue stasis as a first order priority in warfare, right? So they will do what they have to do to stay alive. So if that means killing off part of their system, turning off part of their system, stopping operations in this area so they can reorient operations elsewhere, they'll do that. They'll avoid existential crisis. They'll do things that maintain the system's health. First and foremost, it may take them time to realize that's occurring. It may take them time to reorient resources to do that, but that's what they will do. And then they won't operate in ways that the adversary wants them to operate, right? Because again, they want to live. And so those basic assumptions, those basic ideas inform how I view the principles of war. And so I think first and foremost, if I'm talking about my principles or what I think they should be updated to, first, they should reflect the fact that wars are no longer battle centric, right? Campaigns are what win wars over time, right? Or campaigns are what set in motion the conditions through which politicians can then settle the wars, right? And bring wars to a close. And so you have to think at the campaign level, if you're thinking principles of war, really they should be called principles of warfare, but I just kept that terminology because that's what everybody says. But pragmatism should be at the fore of what everybody does, right? You shouldn't be tied to one way of thinking, so that goes back to what I said about maneuver and the offensive, right? You have to be pragmatic and say, what does the situation dictate? And what do I need to do to adjust to that? So that should be the first principle. Unpredictability. So again, going back to the idea of maneuver, for instance, like always saying that and saying, we're going to be a maneuver-based whatever, force, that will get you in trouble when it comes time to fight somebody, because you're always going to be trying to shoehorn this thing in, this concept of fighting into a situation where it may be ill disposed, and so you're going to be fighting the situation instead of fighting the opponent, or fighting both at the same time. But at the end of the day, that will sub-optimize how you operate. And so we have to be unpredictable. We have to sense the situation and develop alternatives that match the situation and put us in the best possible position. Information needs to be a principle of warfare. I think it's, again, like I said, information, and I think as we move forward into the future, it's going to be increasingly more important. But weaponized information, right? It's not how do I bring information in, process it, and then filter it and push it out. We got to be thinking about information as a weapon, especially as like sensors and drones and things like that become more prevalent in the battlefield moving forward in the future. A lot of folks talk about this idea of transparency on the battlefield increasing. Information is going to become even more important in that situation. And so we have to think about ways to weaponize information. So poisoning information, corrupting information, making things appear in ways that they aren't. So deception should be a huge part of that. And so at the same time, protecting our own information and making sure that we're getting good information coming in, and we can sort bad information from good information and use that. And again, going back to the idea that the system is fighting to maintain stasis, information is going to be critical to that. Sustainment, that's a principle. I think that one doesn't really need, much emphasis added to it. Like if you can't sustain yourself, you're not going to be like, it doesn't matter what your objective is or how much economy of force you're doing or any of that. Sustainment has to be at the front. And so that's in there. And I also mentioned a general, because I put in there a heuristic on how to think about sustainment. And one of the things that I talk about in there is resource expenditure and an adversarial concept, and how we have to think about the use and expenditure of resources, because that's going to be extremely critical. Because I think, for instance, just as an example from what's really going on, because I know sometimes in my head I get too theoretical and I'm like seeing things and I'm not putting it in a way that resonates. But if you think about Bakhmut, for instance, I think that is an example of weaponized sustainment, right? I think personally, my personal interpretation is that Russia's using that as a diversion to consume Ukrainian resources, men, material, equipment, for the purpose of consuming Ukrainian resources, right? And there's no real big picture objective to it other than that. We're going to consume your stuff. And so that, I think, is another reason that we have to think about sustainment. We won't necessarily try to fight that way, the West. We'll talk about trying to be judicious in how we do things, but you may get sucked into that kind of fight unintentionally. Mosul's a good example of that, right? Mosul was the situation where, the expenditure of precision-guided munitions on the Western coalition's part exceeded what they ended up having on hand. And that's all open source. You can see it anywhere. And so sustainment issues, especially at the tail end of the Battle of Mosul, became very tenuous as the coalition and the Iraqis were waiting on more precision munitions to come in. And so, again, that's just something that it doesn't matter that you don't want to fight that way, fighting a resource high resource consumption battle or campaign, but you may get forced into that. And then redundancy, and this is tied to the previous one really closely, redundancy, right? We have to have, because of the lethality that's on the battlefield today, we have to have more redundant forces out there and more redundant ways of doing things. Fuller's writing about how to overcome the machine gun on an open, battlefield. We're not talking about overcoming machine guns. We're talking about overcoming massive amounts of precision-guided munitions, hypersonics, and all sorts of other stuff like that. And so redundancy, I think, is important. There's a lot of talk about, and I mentioned this earlier, distributing, right? I think distributing in lighter forces is probably the exact opposite thing you want to do on a hyper observant battlefield in which you can be precisely targeted. Redundancy through, larger formations, mass to a degree, will help hide things far better than being dispersed will hide things, right? That'll attract attention. A lone sustainment convoy moving to a position, far away, hidden in the mountains. Well, that's telling people where formations are. It's telling the enemy where your logistics are, right? Because what's the only thing that's going to be moving up and down the road at that point? And so I think that that's important to consider as we think about principles of war. Redundancy. Overwhelming, right? So when we factor in resources, overwhelming the enemy's system is one way that we help consume resources, right? And so we have to think when we talk about operations and campaigns, it's about overwhelming not just at a point, but the entire system. And so this was going back to the discussion and getting to hang out with Robert Leonard last week. This is one of the things that he talked about in our side conversations that we were having, is that you never see pursuits today, right? Pursuits are something that just don't happen for a variety of reasons. But that was going back to Napoleon. That was one of the big ways that Napoleon won his battles, was through the pursuit. And what that is systemic overwhelming the enemy's system, right? Like the tail's trying to get away, it's trying to stay alive, but you overwhelm it. And so I think that that's another thing that we have to continue to think about. And then the last two here, mobility, I think is one of the first order principles, no matter what. If you can't move, regardless of whether it's an individual's ability to move from a position to a position, or a squad's ability to move, or an army's ability to move, the lack of mobility will end things for you. And you see this, Mariupol, the Ukrainian army loses its mobility because it's hunkered down, and that's not a slight on them or their tactics or anything. But it's just an observation on what, generally what happened. And so they lost mobility, they started constricting, and then they got overrun there in Mariupol. Same thing happened in Donetsk in 2014 at the Second Battle of Donetsk Airport. They consolidated down on the airport. They ended up getting overwhelmed, surrounded, and they lost that battle, right? And so mobility, I think if you look at these bigger battles and how they fit within the campaigns, they play a vital part in warfare. And then the last one is transitions, right? And this ties to the comment I had on the pursuit and exploitation, right? We have to think about transitions. Transitions are what allow you to keep pressure on the system, right? And it's all about making the enemy system fail. And so you do that through transitions, thinking ahead of transitions, not reactive transitions, because in many cases, a reactive transition doesn't have the weight behind it that it would need. So you can think through a lot of the general transitions that occur in wars and battles, right? So there's a transition from moving to an attack or a defense, right? You can plan that ahead of time. You have a general idea. Transition from attack to defense, right? Counterattacks. Things like this are transitions that you can think about ahead of time and plan for and put the weight behind it and set it aside and say, I know that we need to continue to maintain pressure. So I'm setting this aside for phase 2, so that's the overwhelm and maintain pressure on the enemy system thing. And then I guess there's one more. Timeliness is the last one. And that goes to, that's linked with the other one as well. So you want to have timely operations. You want to do things not just in time. You want to have identified the transitions well in advance so that you can quickly move through those. And, one of the example I use in the paper is, Patton's relief of the 101st and the surrounded U.S. forces there at Bastogne after the German counteroffensive. Patton thought through everything ahead of time. When he left to go to the meeting with Eisenhower, and right after the Germans had invaded, he told his staff, he said, hey, there's 3 options. They come up with 3 options. And he said, based off what I tell you after this meeting is the plan we're going to initiate. So he had thought through it ahead of time. He had allocated the resources tentatively, right? He had prepared his staff so that he could just say whatever the code word was, Alabama, on Alabama, we're doing this. And so they did that. And so I think that that's the last one there. And then just big picture, we got to think holistically about how the system can be stressed. And we've got to think about aligning the principles for operational level thinking, because principles at the tactical level, I think, are fairly easy. It's go that way, do whatever task it is you have to do to achieve whatever effect it is you have to do. That's fairly straightforward. But at the operational level, I think, is where we really need to focus on the principles of war, which would really be principles of warfare. And it should be focused on disorganizing, dislocating, and exhausting the enemy's warfighting system.
Just a couple of principles there. not too many, but no, 9 is a good number. You know why? Because it's not 10, and they'll stick in people's minds. No, Amos, thank you very much for running us through your paper and explaining how the principles of war evolved in the 20th century, but also how we need to adapt them for warfare in the 21st century. And note that word there, listeners. Warfare is something that Amos has repeated, is something where the principles really, really take shape. And quite commonly, we miss the point between the differences of war and warfare. So these are quite interesting principles I'm going to have to keep running through in my head. The really good part about your explanations in the paper for each of the principles, they're the longest explanation for each principle of war I've ever seen, and that's a sad indictment because some of them have only a paragraph here to explain them, and it's still more than what I've seen on other ones, right? But also you provide a little bit of algebra in there for people as well, so with some of your heuristics. So it's always good to keep people thinking. But now, Amos, the part you've been dreading, the final question. At over 112 episodes, this could be possibly episode 113, possibly episode 114. We just don't know yet because we haven't talked about the schedule yet with my co-producer. But there's a lot of definitions sitting behind you right now. Not physically, because that would be really scary. Yeah. But we have to join Carl. We have time to put you up there in the pantheon of the greats, or not. Could be down on the balcony with the other people. So let's ask you this question, the one that all guests get, and it relates to our mission on the show, which is to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. And I ask each guest to finish this sentence. The sentence starts, war is. So Amos, a long-time listener, first-time caller, long-time thinker, I ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
So before I finish the sentence, I just want to say that this is always the part of the show where I end up yelling, usually in my car, you're wrong, or that's stupid. So I caveat my definition with that. So for me, war is a competition between two or more actors, open adaptive systems, and exhaustion is the way by which militaries take politicians to the place they need to be to negotiate whatever the case may be, peace, the settlement, however the war ends between political negotiation. At the end of the day, I agree with Dead Carl. It is a political endeavor, and thus politicians are the ones who have to end it. However, militaries get the politicians to that place through that competition between open adaptive systems that think, want to live, and are not going to throw up their hands and say, oh, wow, look at who we're fighting. We give up. They're going to say, oh, wow, look at who we're fighting. How can we overcome their system and generate enough exhaustion in that system that they no longer are able to continue or are no longer willing to continue fighting?
Now, Amos, and ladies and gents, I think that is probably a cathartic response after listening to so many different responses to that question. And Amos, thank you very much for that definition relating to a competition between open adaptive systems. That's what war is. A bit more complex than some of the ones we've had already this season. I did like the one that just said war is killing. I mean, like, well,
fair enough.
You're not wrong. So we've had some very, very interesting ones this season already because, I mean, we've had a wide range of topics this season already. We're only 4 or 5 episodes into it, but Nazi soldiers, war games, Russian perceptions of war in Eastern Europe, principles of war. We're bouncing around from history to theory to training and to current conflict. So it's fantastic the different definitions we're getting because that's what Carl wanted us to do, to think about it and to keep discussing these things. And, as a good soldier, I'll do what the Major General says. Now, Amos, thank you very much for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on the principles of war, and thank you for writing this, albeit a couple of years ago, and I finally got to it. But also, that's the beauty of information, right? If it's catalogued and stored somewhere, you don't need to get to it straight away. But thank you very much for coming on the show, and please keep up the efforts in educating all of us about war and warfare.
Thank you, Mick. I appreciate it. And again, it's a big honor to be on the show. Been again, long-time listener, first-time caller. Super stoked to be here. So thank you very much.
And listeners, the most accurate thing Amos has said all night is that it's an honour to be on the show. So please honour our guests and go back and listen to some of the guests you may or may not have heard. There are some good theoretical episodes that pair quite nicely with this episode, like a nice wine with some cheese, or I like to have like a Pinot Noir with my pasta. So think about it like that. Listeners, we do have more content coming for you this year, and then later on this year, one thing we didn't mention when we were talking about Napoleon earlier in the show is that we will also be doing a European tour with the Dead Prussian this year as well. So later on the year, I'll be out roaming some of the battlefields around Western Europe, and also some of the battlefields in the UK. The battlefields in the UK are a little bit older than the ones in Western Europe in terms of the reasons and why I'm going to them, but there's some, compared to Australia, there's some pretty old historical battles there that we can go visit. So please keep your eye out for that. At the end of the year, you'll see some content related to that as well. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Follow the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod and Facebook at facebook.com/thedeadprussian. The Dead Prussian podcast is a Hollow Street Media production. It is hosted and produced by Mick Cook and co-produced by Brooke Winnell. The Dead Prussian podcast is copyright of Hollow Street Media.